Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jim van Geel. We are here physically in the Public Library of Amsterdam at the IHLIA Square on the 3rd floor. And we're sitting in front of part of the exhibition It Doesn't Stop at Images by Pablo Lerma, who is sitting right next to me. As I said, my name is Jim van Geel. I used to be the curator of public program here at IHLIA, which I've left 2 months ago to work elsewhere, but I'm very happy to be back for this Q&A today on my old sort of stomping grounds. As I said, I'm joined by Pablo Lerma, who is an image-based artist, publisher, and educator based here in Amsterdam. His artistic practice is developed at the intersection of image and text, with a focus in visual archives and vernacular materials that deal with the concepts of time, erosion, identity, and counter-narrative. His work takes various forms of photographic installations to publications. So that's a little, basically your artist bio read out loud.
Yes.
But maybe you would like to introduce yourself and give a bit more personal introduction than the artist bio.
Well, hello, I'm Pablo Lerma, and I think you did a great introduce to my practice. But yeah, definitely, I always work with archives. That's kind of like my motor to do different projects. So quite interested always in ideas of representation through the archives and how my experience always reflects when I'm transitioning these archives and looking at the visual materials that they hold.
And can you tell a bit about how this exhibition that we're sitting in front of came to be? So a bit of the prehistory, what led you to this, what other projects have you done in your career so far?
Yeah, I think, It Doesn't Stop at Images starts in 2020. So I've been approached at that moment by Fotodog, that it's another Dutch institution in the Netherlands, in Utrecht. And they're organizing a cycle of exhibitions on the idea of archives and family and representation. So they approached me and we talked about a previous project that I did years ago when I lived in the US. It was called Bring Through the Archive, and it was this publication that I did around this found box with almost 600 negatives. And at that moment I was dealing with ideas again of representation, or I would say like the lack of representation when thinking about vernacular photography. And when I'm approached by Fotodog, I thought, well, this is a really good opportunity to kind of like create or start new projects. Since for me, Bring Through the Archive, it's a project that only operates as a book form, and it has this intimate relation between the reader and the materials. And so that's how I kind of like diving through the possibilities of starting a new collaboration with a new archive here in the Netherlands. I came across Geel, and I thought that for me it was an amazing opportunity to work for the first time with a queer archive. And along the first conversations here at IHLIA, I just discovered that this is the largest collection of LGBTQ materials in Europe. So that was kind of like mind-blowing to think like, I'm gonna have access to this wide pool of materials, and I would say I was a bit overwhelmed when going through the different rooms and seeing how many things I wanted to look at and dive into. But yeah, that was kind of like the genesis of It Doesn't Stop at Images. This first exhibition that happened in Fotodog Utrecht, and how that project we are able now to show it here and kind of come full circle and show the materials in the archive where the research comes from.
Mm-hmm. And you just touched upon it as well, that you used to live in the US.
Yes.
So you're, so this exhibition as well somehow is intertwined with your personal history and places where you have lived. Can you maybe elaborate on where you come from and how long you've been in the Netherlands, these things?
Yeah, I think that, for me it was when I landed here at IHLIA and I started looking at all these amazing rooms with materials, I just realized that I was coming here with a lot of expectations. I would say implicit expectations. And that idea came to me a few weeks after I started looking into materials, because I just realized that there was certain disappointment growing inside me when looking at these materials here.
What kind of disappointment?
Well, I just realized that I could not place my experience in the materials that I was looking at. And I was confronted by certain stereotypes of the LGBTQ community, and especially stereotypes of gay men, that I kind of like grew up having them in the back of my head, and kind of like thinking why I had those stereotypes. And I think that was one of like the moments when I started this project here, like trying to understand my own experience by confronting all of these questions and all of these stereotypes that I grew up as a gay man. And I think I'm quite happy that we're sitting here, because this panel has a couple of images, or I would say like a constellation of images that it's quite important for me in relation to this question of the stereotypes. So there are a couple of images in my bag, and I'm like, we will be able to show it to the people on the Instagram Live. There are like two images where they're like palms, and there is a white building in the background. Those images are from Sitges, that it's a town outside of Barcelona, that it's my hometown. And I started recalling all of these memories when I came to IHLIA, to go to this town when I had maybe like 11, 12, or even like 14 years old. I cannot really recall exactly the time, but I was like underage for sure. And I used to go there with my family, and it was a beautiful town outside of Barcelona, with an amazing weather that has been fostering the LGBTQ community for decades. And as other places like San Francisco or Fire Island or Provincetown in the US. So I remember going there without having that knowledge, or knowing that it was this space for queer people. And I remember taking these walks at night in front of the sea, and seeing all of these men, like very tall. I'm short, but they were, for me, they were like really gigantic. Yeah, they were like really imposing their like persona, and they were all wearing this like leather attire. And they were at the boardwalk, and they had this sort of like a cruising attitude. And I mean, I'm able to verbalize this now, but at that moment I couldn't verbalize it in this way. But I was so fascinated by looking at them. I remember thinking like, why they're wearing a costume in summer? It's so hot. Why they're wearing this leather? But still, it was so fascinating and flamboyant. But at the same time that I was looking at these men, I remember like listening comments from my family or the people around from the town saying, "Oh, those are faggots." And I kind of like grew up with kind of like that denial, or that sort of like confrontation to certain stereotypes. And I think I was able to think about them when I came here. And in the beginning, I had that sort of disappointment. I just realized that I went through a big amount of materials in my first weeks at IHLIA, that they were dealing with all of these stereotypes of sexuality, disease, and intercourse. That, for me, they were part of my own stereotypes growing up. So that's why I was able to understand why I was having this sort of like disappointment, because I realized I'm looking for a different type of image. I'm just trying to understand why our community is being framed only through this lens, that it's very heteronormative, and how I can find my own experience in this archive. And that's how it comes, your question. I'm sorry for this kind of like very long introduction. Where I just started to think about my own experience and how that related to the LGBT community in the places where I can live in. So I thought that this project should be related to those places, those locations where I've been living, and they've been very important to my own identity. And that's how I decided to create these 3 chapters in the project that relate to these 3 locations. So I lived in the US. I'm originally from Spain, but when I started the project, I've been living in the Netherlands for almost 3 years. So I just wanted to structure the project in this sort of like chapter way, and try to understand my connection and my experience with those locations, but also try to understand from a historical point of view, because I decided to frame my research in the decade that I was born, that's the 80s, but also the decade before and the decade after. Just to understand what was happening before me and during my moment before coming out, through the archive and through the publications.
And maybe to take one step back, you just mentioned that in your first few weeks at IHLIA you went through a really big amount of material. Could you talk about how did you actually go about working in the archive? Like, what did you do? How long did it take? I don't know, more of a practical standpoint.
Yeah.
Like, how did you engage with these materials?
Well, for me, it was something new to work with an LGBTQ archive. So again, I thought that I didn't have any expectations, but then through all of this like disappointment of spending hours, I used to spend like at least 1 day per week between 6 and 8 hours, just like in the basement, looking at like the different shelves or the different boxes. It was very intense because I'm very systematic in the way that I want to look at materials. So if I pick up a book, a publication or a folder or a box, I want to see everything. And sometimes that was draining for me because I was like choosing materials.
But you were already, sorry to interrupt, but basically like from the moment that you started looking and like digging through these boxes, at the same time you were already also scanning things and taking things out, or just like
not yet.
letting it wash over you in a way?
Yeah, it was for me the first maybe like the first 8 weeks, like 2 months. I just needed to wrap my head around the archive. I had many conversations with Wilfred, the head of the collections, just to understand the dynamics of the archive and where are the decisions taken from the archive to like highlight certain materials or collect certain materials. So through those conversations, I was able to understand historically those selections of materials. I was able to relate that to my experience, and I think at that moment I realized I had the first hint to understand what was my connection with the materials that I was looking at. And that was when I moved into the magazine section. I remember there is a section with clippings from newspapers. And after spending a few weeks at the book section, where I was like kind of like having this disappointment, I thought, well, I'm just going to start, instead of like just like looking to everything, I'm just going to start filtering my search. I'm just going to start aligning with my own interest. So I'm going to think about ideas of affection and tenderness and family. And I picked up this box that, if I'm not wrong, the keyword was family or parenthood. I cannot recall exactly the keyword. And then I just like came across the clippings from the newspapers, and of course there was a language barrier for me. I don't speak Dutch. At that moment I was working with an assistant. She's Dutch, Martha, so she was able to kind of like help me in the process of like reading the text. But then I came across this beautiful interview from late 70s in a major newspaper in the Netherlands, where they're interviewing a family, a mother and a father, and they are asked by the journalist how it's for them to raise a gay child. And that for me was a wow moment. First of all, because of the openness of talking about that in a newspaper in such a length, it was almost like 3 pages. But then secondly, it was this like very like raw and daily life approach. There was no filter for me when looking also at the images. So that was the moment like I realized I just need to start filtering my search. I had enough time just like looking at materials, let's say randomly. I'm just going to start like filtering in a way that I really want to find the materials. And that's how I came directly to the conclusion of reading these 3 chapters, this time frame between the 70s and the 90s. And I started looking specifically for magazines or publications that were created in those locations, in those decades, and they had a big amount of materials in the archive. So I could access to a certain amount of publications, so that will give me enough room for me to understand visually those connections between my experience and the publications.
Mm. And maybe then to get into the exhibition that we're sitting in front of now, maybe for the people viewing who haven't yet had the chance to go to the exhibition, can you talk us through what we would see or what one would see when they come here?
Yeah, the exhibition it's divided, I would say, in two different groups of materials. One of them is the materials that are the original materials from the archive, and they are displayed in the vitrines. Mm-hmm. And those vitrines are displayed throughout the entire building. Because for me it was really important to understand how people transitions in this building, that it's a public library, mm-hmm. and how most probably they're not aware that it's a queer archive in this building with such a largest collection. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to bring the conversation to these different floors, or the people's or the places where people will socialize. So there are a couple of vitrines in this third floor, and then we place two more vitrines on the sixth floor, where is the forum from the OVA. Mm-hmm. So usually there is a lot of transit from the people who comes from to the building. And then also I wanted to bring one to the staff area, because there's so many people working in the offices, but I'm not sure if they're aware about IHLIA as a queer archive. So I was talking with Flora, with the curator, and asking, can we make this bold movement and just like remove the main table that's in front of the coffee machine and just like put there a vitrine? So in some way trying to trigger the staff members, the workers of the building, to look at the vitrine and think about the materials that they were looking at while they're having their break or just having a casual conversation in front of the coffee machine. Yeah. So that's kind of like one of the sections or one of the parts of this project at IHLIA. And then the second one are these vitrines that you can see one behind us. There are three vitrines, and each of them relates to one of these chapters in one of these publications. So yeah, that's kind of like the, I will say, I don't know if it's a brief description, but the description of, of the two parts of the exhibition.
Great, thank you. And then in these vitrines here, we see images, a lot of images put together. I was wondering what your selection process was when engaging with the archival material, the original materials. Why did certain things get picked? Maybe why others didn't get picked? And then also, as a follow-up question right away, what is your decision-making process in arranging them, especially in the vitrines behind us?
Well, for me it was really important to go through all the materials. And when I say all, I just like gather all the boxes from one of the publications, and I spent days until I saw every page on every issue that IHLIA had about that publication. And I did that as a first round, just to get a sense of the publication, how they were targeting their audience, and what type of material they were making visual and accessible for the audience. I did a bit of research on the background of the publication, just to understand why it exists through these decades, what is the connection with the community, just to also like wrap my head around the background of the publication and understand the connection between materials and audience. And then after that, I did my kind of like second round, where I go again through each magazine, and I start thinking about the images. First of all, how they are placed in relation to the text, but secondly, how they relate to kind of like a bigger category. And most probably I should say like categories. I start like categorizing the images. So these new categories came through my connection and experience on this specific publication. But at the same time, I didn't want to create any sort of like formula to repeat over and over for each publication. So I wanted also to understand the dynamics of each location and publication in order to bring the best for that experience. So for example, the first chapter that's related to homologie, that is the Dutch publication. Homologie has this background that it's rooted into academia and gender studies, And that relates directly to my experience now as a professor in the Netherlands. So that was like a strong connection to the publication. But again, there was this barrier with the language. So I spent most of the time going through the publication, just looking at pictures. And my connection was directly through pictures, and completely visual. At some point, I was showing certain articles and trying to translate, or asking my assistant, like, can you tell me more? Because I had certain intuitions that I couldn't verify. But it was extremely visual in the way that I built those categories to make a final selection. And then for the second chapter that relates to San Francisco Sentinel, I just came across this beautiful publication with San Francisco Sentinel that starts as a newspaper, kind of like takes an evolution as a small magazine, I would say, compared to sizes. And I just realized that San Francisco Sentinel in the 70s, early 70s, there is this beautiful joy of representation through images, through text. There is a lot of freedom, and you can see that when you go through the publication. And in that case, I had the access to the language. I could read also the text. And in the late 70s, you start visualizing in the publication for the first time the word gay cancer. And then by the 80s, the publication is moving a lot of pictures. And then text becomes more and more important. And at that moment, I just realized that text was becoming an image for me. That text was a substitute for the images that I couldn't see. And that's when I decided that text should become an image in these projects. And I started creating these posters where I collected the word gay, nominating something else. And I created a poster every year. So again, there is no formula, while in the first chapter I'm creating more like constellation of images, and there is this barrier of the language, so it's completely visual, my connection. The second one is how text becomes an image. But also still I select a few pictures from the publication that is from a small section that survives throughout the decades of the publication. And then there is this third chapter that is behind us that relates to Lambda. There is a publication from my hometown in Barcelona. And here, there are like a couple of things that they change, but still might resemble to the other ones. There is no text, even though I'm including ads from different places that relate to my experience. So they're like ads from like discos or clubs that I went when I was not a teenager, but maybe like 19 or 20 in Barcelona. But also the images are completely linked to my experience as a young gay man going out to my hometown. So people who's depicted in these images, it's people that I knew at some point who were going to clubs, or they were like kind of like gravitating in the community. So at the end, for me, it's like building each chapter takes this exercise of also creating layers of meaning through the selection, and also creating these constellations. That it was kind of like your question. How I take the decisions to create these panels. For me, it's very intuitive, but at the same time, there are like certain categories in my head that are very clear when looking at each specific publication. But still, I want to give enough room to the viewer to place their own experience and create their own connections. That's why for me it has to be so like fluid, and the constellations of images kind of like move around the space without any specific structure. It's more like mutable, I would say. So yeah, hopefully anyone who's coming to visit the exhibition, they can find any link or alignment with the picture, and from there kind of like start a thread of connections through the panel.
It's a bit, they look like these sort of like, I don't know, when you watch movies, that they have like these FBI researchers or whatever, no? That they have these like big walls with images of this like police research. It's a really generous offering of images, I think. So I would definitely advise everyone to still go see it. Sunday is the last day, so do go see it. I was wondering, with these images from this specific time period. Do you feel a responsibility when working with these materials other than practical? For instance, I did the images, some of the images that we see here, I think there's many images from this time period, and perhaps even still today, are not free of problematics. In this time period, and still to this day, the gay, white, male voice is very omnipresent in the LGBT community, and I think also engaging with these magazines, like there's a clear lack of representation when talking about gender diversity or color as well. How do you deal with these images when this is sort of your artistic material and the reproduction thereof?
Yeah. Definitely for me, when I'm going through all of these magazines, I can realize from the very beginning that the scope of representation is very narrow, and as you're mentioning, there is always a focus on the white gay men through the three publications. Maybe at the San Francisco Sentinel there is more diversity coming into the magazines, but in general each magazine has their own like in and outs going on. And for example, Homology, there are like certain articles happening by the last years where they talk about intersectionality. And that's something that I think it's quite interesting when I'm looking at it. Even though in the installation you cannot really access to those materials. I choose to show images of these images because those are the ones that align directly with my experience, and I felt like it was difficult for me to start thinking about other identities or other experience, since I might share like a small part of the struggle as being part of the LGBTQ community, but it's still really difficult to place other experiences into the installation. And at the same time, I want to feel like that I was like appropriating those experiences to bring them to this work. But as much as I could, I was trying to also like understand why these publications had this lack of representation, and how like the small amount of representation that happened could be also visible in the installation. But yeah, definitely there is. I think there is a lot of wideness to discuss in relation to these publications and their background and how they being represented gay men, specifically for the decades that they were running.
Yeah, I think it's something we could talk at length about. Yeah. Unfortunately, today we are quite limited in time. Maybe as a last question, the title, it doesn't stop at images. You already said where the title comes from. But where does it continue? What is next for you in your practice? What are you moving forward to?
Well, I think for me, these projects gave me lots of insights to even continue with the materials that I generated at IHLIA. The selection that I show in the installations, it's like a small selection. Just like to give you an idea, from Homology, I was able to collect almost 2,500 images, but I only show like 300, 400. So this is kind of like an ongoing process where, depending on the space where I'm showing the images, I'm able to adapt depending on the amount of space, but also kind of like the background of the institution. So it's something that I don't think it's kind of like, it doesn't finish here, so it will be like evolving, and there are like more ideas to develop specific pieces in relation to parts of this project, like for example the posters where I have the gay list. One of my goals with that piece is to think about how language can also become, how text becomes these images, but also how language can become sound, and thinking about ways of developing that a specific piece of the posters as a performance, and hopefully with a queer choir, and thinking about also the history of the communities in San Francisco and how that related to their own choir. But yeah, it's like I feel like I have this massive amount of materials that they're treasures, and I can spend a lot of hours like going through them and still like developing this project and kind of like adapting, yeah, to other formats or venues.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Pablo. And also thank you for joining us this evening. As I said before, Sunday is the last day, so if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, you should go see it. The exhibition is open for free to the public, so you can come here. You don't need a time slot. It is in the Public Library of Amsterdam, which has different rules than museums, so it's a little different. You can just go here. And also I want to mention that I think it's the next exhibition at IHLIA, but I'm not quite sure since having left. But I want to mention that Noah Little soon will have an exhibition here, who's been an embedded researcher at IHLIA through the Critical Visitor Project, and they will present an exhibition here about also the history of IHLIA and how certain collections came to be and what choices were made in this selection process, also from an intersectional point of view. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Jim.